Professor Van-Tam, I'd asked you before the break about the issue of lack of communication. I should perhaps just make clear, and this isn't really a question for you necessarily, that the particular concern expressed later in this report had been not about difficulties in communication between the CMOs for the devolved nations, but particular concerns about ministerial coordination, and in particular the fact that the JMC Health Committee hadn't met since 2002. So there hadn't been a specific criticism suggesting a lack of communication between the CMOs.
No, thank you for that clarification. And I'm, clearly only cited from my work as DCMO on communications that our office had with our counterparts in the devolved administrations, and meetings where ministers from the devolved administrations met with our ministers, usually the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, to discuss pandemic updates and progress and so forth. And usually I was the support DCMO for those inter-ministerial discussions, which, from memory, and it is slightly difficult for me to recall that kind of blur, I was in a very large number of those meetings with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the ministers from the devolved nations discussing the COVID crisis. I would hesitate to say it was weekly. I would also hesitate to say it was less than fortnightly. And that could actually be checked for the record, I'm sure.
Thank you. If we can go over the page. The next issue that was identified in this report was about turnover of senior staff, and reference there both to the Department of Health, to NHS senior management, but also to ministerial churn is the phrase that's been used quite a lot in the evidence that the inquiry's heard. Again, any observations you have from your particular perspective, as you've described it to us, on the implications of matters such as that for the machinery of public health decision making?
So that there is turnover of senior staff is certainly true. I really couldn't offer any kind of comment about whether proportionally compared to other industries or compared to different periods of time, that turnover is now greater or lesser than it has been in the past in relation to officials. Obviously, the news tells its own story of the kind of political turbulence we've all witnessed on our TV screens in the last 6 months or so, which I comment only on as a layperson. There is undoubtedly an importance in terms of civil service careers, and let me be very clear, I'm not a civil servant with a long-term career in Whitehall. There is some degree of importance attached to circulating around ministries to get wider experience, and it is naturally used by junior members of staff as a way to get into more senior positions, because you have to wait for those vacancies to appear, and you might have a chosen senior next senior vacancy in a given department, but no understanding of when that might show up, and you might need to take advantage somewhere else. So there is all of that. I have read papers that argue a point that is actually quite healthy to have that kind of movement of staff, but equally it is also valuable where you find individual civil servants who have got to a certain point in their careers and they have said, I am now staying in health. I am pretty sure I'm staying in health. I might move around a little bit within health, but I'm staying there. And those are the people in whom there's a lot more kind of deeper corporate long-term memory and knowledge.
The next area in the report refers to inadequate monitoring and reporting systems, and you'll see their reference to the Cumberland Review, the IMMDS review. Now, we've explored that in a greater degree of detail with Dame June Rain, in particular from the perspective of the MHRA. But are there any observations you have from your perspective in public health and as DCMO on the issues that are raised there?
Really nothing further beyond that which I've already said to you, that if you do have what I would call a kind of dispersed incident, it's always discovered in one locality first, and it can take time for that signal to emerge that this is kind of a national signal of a rise in a particular, cases of a particular disease or an organism. So it takes time for that to be apparent. The health protection agencies, in the modern day that's the UK Health Security Agency, do have quite sophisticated systems for looking at the reporting of organisms and noting kind of spikes and exceedances, and they have their own kind of pathways of escalation to look at those to determine if they are artifactual or genuine, and then to trigger an incident, as it were. And that naturally takes time. It is never instantaneous, and that is something we have to live with. But in terms of the kind of the more general comment about inadequacy of monitoring and reporting systems, I don't think I can offer any specialist expertise in that area above that which Professor Rain has undoubtedly offered to you.
The next issue is lack of attention to the patient voice. Again, an invitation to you, Professor Van-Tam, as to whether you have any observations on that, but also what you see as the role of patients and patient representative organisations within the public health field.
Yeah. Look, the only experiences I have of this are personal ones related to family healthcare matters, which I don't think are within the domain of this inquiry. But from those, I would say that, I'm under oath, I have to be absolutely candid with you. I have, in those particular circumstances, sometimes encountered a degree of kind of, as you say in your text, cultural defensiveness in patches. So I think that is a credible comment. I think I relate to it in terms of my personal experiences. In relation to patients raising concerns or complaints, I think the vast majority of people do so because they genuinely have a concern or a complaint, and they are seeking to understand and to be understood. So it's very helpful if the recipient of the concern can properly understand why it's been raised and actually addresses the concern directly rather than offering a series of platitudes. But that's me. This is a very personal thing. I believe in straight talking, and I believe patients that raise concerns only do so because they don't understand something or want to get to the bottom of it, and it is important to meet them at their point of need and explain it.
Dr. Rain, when talking about the MHRA, told us about various measures and systems being put in place or in place already at the MHRA to have greater patient involvement or involvement of patient representative organisations in their decision-making processes. In relation to the Chief Medical Officer's office, what role did talking to patients or patient groups have in terms of the decision-making of the CMO and DCMOs?
I recall during the pandemic meeting on more than one occasion a number of different groups, patient representative groups and faith organisations as well, to help them turn the government's general advice into something that was kind of lived and meaningful for example, in different religious settings, in terms of forms of worship and so forth. So, yes, definitely had those conversations, but I think it's only fair to say that they were largely prompted by approaches to us rather than us going and saying we want to talk to the following groups. Now, during the pandemic, you're talking about a group of people in the CMO's office who at the junior levels were working 12 hours a day, and at the senior levels were possibly working somewhere between 14 and 16 hours a day. That comment has to be made in terms of the remaining bandwidth to do any more work, frankly, during that pandemic crisis.
The next concern identified in this report to the inquiry was, well, we've got the heading there, limited scope for challenge and testing of policy decisions, and potentially concerns either on decision-making in silos or difficulty in people speaking their minds. Do you have any observations from your perspective as the DCMO, or again more widely in public health decision-making, about those concerns?
So I've, before the pandemic and during the pandemic, it has always been my job, and I've seen it as a core part of my job, to be in there with the policy teams on a day-to-day basis, literally speaking my mind, not in an opinionated way, but one backed by scientific judgment and rationale, but also backed by one's own personal sense of what is the right thing to do sometimes. But I've very much spoken my mind with the policy teams. I think sometimes, to be truthful, I've been, because of my directness, I've probably been very challenging to a few of them. I don't think they resent me for it. I think they just know that that's how I do it. But I have been very challenging, and I've felt very free to speak my mind. And if I've felt that the policy decision was not the right one in terms of either public health principles or wider healthcare ethics or something, I have always felt free to wander into the Chief Medical Officer's office. That was irrespective of whether it was Dame Sally or Sir Chris, to voice my concerns and have those heard and get some always good advice from them on how to approach that. And I've always been quite happy to have a direct conversation with the Permanent Secretary when I haven't been comfortable about the way something is going, based either on a science principle or just a kind of rightness principle. And so no, I haven't felt constrained at all.
And it may not be possible for you to answer this, Professor, but do you have any sense of whether those not in such a position of seniority as yourself within the department, whether perhaps more junior civil servants have the same freedom to speak up within the DHSC.
Yes. So it gets more difficult, doesn't it, when you're having to, when you feel you've got a challenge to raise and you're relatively junior. In any organisation, that is always difficult. Is the culture in the Department of Health and Social Care one where people are free to raise those concerns in the modern day? I would say absolutely yes. I would look you in the eye and say absolutely yes. Does that mean that every single junior civil servant feels no pressure at all in terms of their bosses and their likely future career trajectory, in terms of what they might say, or the kind of boldness and candour with which they might deliver it? No, I don't think. I think, you know, I think juniors are always more sensitive, but is formally the cultural environment one which encourages that challenge and gives the space and freedom to challenge in safety? Yes, I think it is.
The next paragraph is headed "Reluctance to act on a precautionary basis." We've obviously already explored your approach to or understanding of the precautionary principle and its role. I'm not going to ask you to repeat that evidence, Professor Van-Tam. Do you have any further observations on that issue?
No, only just to kind of, you know, recap on that. Look, it depends what the threat is. It depends how serious it is. It depends how many people it affects. It depends on what can be done about it, and it depends, and it also calls in a judgment about what people ought to know about it, and the precautionary principle definitely exists, but it is applied in a kind of proportionate and judicial way, I think.
We go to the top of the next page, please, Lawrence. The next heading, lack of expertise in evidence and risk assessment, and the particular concern identified here is in relation to the position of ministers, and we've explored with other witnesses, Professor Van-Tam, about the lack of ministerial training and what might be the difficulties for ministers in dealing with what can be highly technical, statistical, epidemiological, etc. Evidence. But again, any observations you have from your perspective as DCMO on that issue?
Yeah. So if there's lack of depth of experience in looking at evidence and risk assessment in ministerial circles, and that could relate to a minister's background, it could relate to the time they have been in office too, then I think it's the job of the civil service, in conjunction with the technical professional agencies, and here of course I'm referring to the UK Health Security Agency in the modern world, supported by the kind of expert judgment of the people who are put in the roles of CMO and DCMO, to literally assist the minister in understanding the evidence and navigating the risk assessment. But yeah, I don't think there's a lack of expertise in the system. I think you may find individuals who are less familiar with the methodologies involved with looking at evidence and the methodologies involved with risk assessment. But overall, I think it's a very competent system in the modern age.
Poor corporate memory is the next factor identified. And again, the inquiry has heard this as a concern expressed from a number of different sources, civil service and ministerial. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yes, I agree with the overall statement. I'm one of a very few scientists, less than I can count on one hand, who could bring to bear experiences from the 2009 pandemic on the current pandemic, just because the personnel and the people had changed. That's nobody's fault, but it is just a fact that there is that kind of churn in the system. And even very senior people had not worked through the last pandemic, certainly not in a health role. And I just have to say it, material that I recall as a researcher in the University of Nottingham, that I had performed research for the Department of Health, as it was then, in 2009, that was logged in the repository. Now, it was a data set, so it wasn't really going to be relevant for the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. But that electronic data set that was carefully logged in with the Department of Health in 2010 is not retrievable. So had it been needed, and it wasn't, but had it been needed in 2020, I don't believe we could have accessed it from government repositories. So there's something about corporate memory in terms of the individuals that is true. There, at least in that period from 2009 through to 2020, there is at least some element of things physically logged that can't now be found.
The next topic, lack of long-term planning and preparedness. Again, any observations you have on that, and obviously very much specifically in relation to long-term preparedness and planning in relation to risks, whether of respiratory conditions or viruses, bloodborne viruses, whatever it may be.
Yeah. So I think there has been long-term planning and long-term preparedness for pandemics. And I think if you look at the Cabinet Office Risk Register, which I think is a public domain document, you can see that consciousness has been there for a long while. If you look at pandemic planning documents from the government and the Department of Health and Social Care, you can see that there have been many iterations of pandemic plans. So I think there has been a degree of long-term planning and preparedness. The kind of incident that I know the inquiry is looking at is rather different in that it is it isn't one where I'm not really sure whether that sits in the domain of the kind of things that we had long-term plans and preparedness for. This is an incident, an unforeseen incident, as far as I can tell. And so when I read this, I thought, well, I don't quite understand that, because I think there has been long-term planning and preparedness in the areas where I kind of, from my perspective, expect it, which is in this kind of very large global public health threat space.
The final topic, resource constraints, perhaps particularly topical given yesterday's budgetary statement. I'm not particularly going to invite your comment on the state of the public purse or resourcing of the NHS generally, but specifically again in relation to the machinery of public health protection and decision making in the United Kingdom. What are the implications in terms of resource constraints?
So I think there just have been measurable, quantifiable, documented cuts in public health budgets and pressure on public health budgets now for more than a decade. Obviously there was a bit of an easing of that during this national crisis that we've just been through, but the long-term trend has been on pressure on public health budgets. And that is kind of understandable at one level, because public health interventions often have a very long trajectory, and you might need to spend now to reap some kind of gain 15 years from now, and that is never attractive in kind of government funding cycles, because the returns are a very long way off. So there have been constraints on public health budgets, and some downward pressure on them as well. Yeah.
And then I'm not going to invite your comment particularly on the observations in the this expert report on how that their concerns could be addressed. Rather, I'm going to ask you, Professor Van-Tam, what you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the current public health landscape in the United Kingdom, and any areas of improvement or steps that you think could or should be taken to improve the position.
So I actually think in terms of the public health landscape, in terms of, I think the bit you're talking about, which is the ability to deal with incidents, I see a kind of better hardwiring from top to bottom than has existed several decades ago. I see genuinely really excellent and highly motivated staff and leaders who I think in the modern age talk to each other very quickly indeed, mobilise the resources they have very quickly indeed, and are a thoroughly decent bunch who I would trust to respond to an emergency with as much vigour and urgency and kind of appropriate weight as was needed. I do think it's a good system now.
Any areas of improvement that you would identify?
I noted in your expert report that your experts had picked up the fact that in public health at the local authorities there were fewer and fewer opportunities for medical practitioners still involved in public health, and that more and more consultants in public health since that reorganisation have been non-medical consultants in public health. Now, they are all absolutely trained on the same syllabus, but I don't think that separation, which is factual. I mean, your report laid down the percentages of medics and non-medics. I don't think that is entirely helpful.
We can take that down, thank you. The last two topics I wanted to ask you about, Professor Van-Tam, are related, and they are about the ability to learn from past mistakes or poor practice, the ability to learn reflectively, and then issues relating to candour and transparency. In relation, just looking at the healthcare system first of all, and then turning separately to government, there have been a number of high-profile reviews and reports into failures in healthcare. The Mid-Staffordshire report is one, the Cumberledge report that we referred to, more recently the Ockenden review in relation to maternity failings, which might suggest that the NHS is still too slow to learn from mistakes and to learn from poor practice and change poor practice. First of all, do you have any thoughts on how that could be addressed or improved?
I don't really have any educated thoughts on the matter, because I'm not an expert in kind of quality assurance and system failure and single points of failure and so forth. I think you probably need to hear from somebody who's an expert in that area. I'm not an expert in that area. But I do think a lot goes well if there is an obsession with quality from the top to the bottom of any organisation. And that for me is really important, that if you put absolute quality at the heart of whatever you do in the healthcare space, that is a very big thing.
One former Secretary of State for Health, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr Hunt, suggested that one feature might be a blame culture, which means people are frightened about being open and transparent. And that may be an observation as applicable to government as to the NHS. And do you have any thoughts or observations on that?
It's a very long while since I was a worker, an everyday worker in the National Health Service. I, like probably most people, read about incidents where a blame culture has arisen. I can't comment on the veracity of it, only to say that clearly it is always easier to learn when you are free from the constraints of worrying about kind of attracting personal blame. Though I think likewise you have to be very candid about what you did and what you didn't do in any particular incident.
And what about within government, the abilities of civil servants, ministers? Again, I appreciate your perspective is from one government department only, Department of Health and Social Care, to learn from or to even acknowledge things that have been done badly or could have been done better, and to try and learn from that. Is that something you saw any positive evidence of?
No, I don't think I can really comment one way or the other on that. I'm not withholding anything. I just can't say that any particular examples where I feel that particularly prominent in my experience.
Are you aware of any systems or processes within the Department of Health and Social Care, whether ones to which the CMO's office is party or more generally, for examining past decisions, past policies, and analysing what could have been done better or differently?
I've certainly been aware of or taken part in a number of kind of wash-up exercises, lessons identified exercises after incidents, yes.
Related to the ability to learn is the issue of candour and transparency.
Yes.
The Mid-Staffordshire report, which I referred to, led to the creation of a statutory duty of candour in England, Scotland, coming into force in Wales, not yet in Northern Ireland, but a statutory duty of candour on NHS bodies. One suggestion that has been made to the inquiry, including from another former Secretary of State for Health, is that there should be a statutory duty of candour imposed more widely, so it would encompass government departments, ministers, a duty to say publicly where things have gone wrong, and identify areas where there could be redress. Do you have any observations on whether that would be a good thing, or indeed a bad thing?
I've always been very direct in terms of how I've communicated with the public. I think it's absolutely right that at all levels of our society, we say when things haven't gone right. Yeah, so yes, I support it.
So those are the issues I was proposing to ask Professor Van-Tam about. I'm conscious of the time and indeed the need that Professor Van-Tam has to be away by 1, but also of the importance of ensuring that I get the opportunity to hear from core participants and legal representatives if there are questions or issues they'd like me to explore. So if we could take perhaps a 20-minute break.
That was exactly what was going through my mind.
I'm grateful.
So let's do that without more ado. Come back at 20 to 1.
Thank you.
Professor Van-Tam, that gives those who are entitled to ask questions through council the chance to formulate those questions and ask her to express them.